Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and welcome back from the weekend. We're going to continue our reading and discussion of the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson, backing up a paragraph or two for continuity purposes to kind of refresh ourselves what we discussed Friday. And that is that the people of Italy were rebelling against the temporal power of the Pope. They no longer wished to submit to a monarchy, a papal monarchy, tired of the dictatorial policies of the papacy, denying him his divine right, as he claimed, the King of Kings. And they wanted a government of and by and for the people, following the example of the United States and all the other nations that followed suit after the Protestant Reformation, developing their own forms of government. The Italians wanted liberty from papal tyranny. And in an attempt to defend the temporal power of the Pope, Austria stepped up, a papal proxy warrior, stepped up and invaded Italy and stopped the rebellion for a time. And the papacy attempted to make concessions that were very superficial in nature. In other words, did nothing to limit his temporal power. And the people began to catch on that the Pope was not sincere in his efforts of reform. So, seeing that Austria, which had occupied Italy for the purpose of defending the papacy's temporal power, seeing that Austria was embattled with Sardinia over territorial wars, some of the provinces of Italy, in effect, threw their allegiance towards Sardinia, making Sardinia a stronger military force to oppose the Austrians. And the papacy, seeing that the provinces of Italy were even willing to side with Sardinia against Austria, the Pope attempted to declare a united Italy under the protection of Sardinia. In fact, in essence, thumbing his nose at Austria, who had come to his aid. That's how desperate the papacy was to maintain its temporal power in Italy. Now, with that, we'll begin with the last full paragraph on page 312, if you're following along in your own copy of the book. About the middle of the page there, it says, "At the Battle of Novara between Austria and Sardinia, Charles Albert, the Sardinian king, was defeated with terrible loss. He immediately abdicated his office and turned over his crown to Victor Emmanuel, his son, who so conducted affairs as to make himself influential in the great movements that led to the peace of Villafranca, and by skillful statesmanship to procure from the Austrians the recession of Lombardy to Sardinia." So, Victor Emmanuel is a very astute statesman and a very astute warrior, and even gained some accessions from the Austrians and regained possession of Lombardy. Now it says, the military strength of Sardinia having been thus increased with the accession of Lombardy, greatly encouraged the Italians. And in order to counteract the influences which were tending to an alliance between them and Victor Emmanuel, the proposition to create an Italian confederacy with the Pope at its head was revived. So here an attempt by the papacy, in order to maintain his temporal throne, was going to throw his hat in with Victor Emmanuel, going to, under his protection, Sardinia's protection, maintain a temporal kingdom of Italy. Now it says, but the Italians, who had become unwilling to submit to the dominion of an absolute monarch any longer, resisted this scheme, and from the conviction that it would still keep them at the feet of their old masters being the Pope and his priests, who ruled with a rod of iron, denied the people rights, acting as though he were God on earth, And the Italians were simply fed up with it, and they weren't going to submit to papal power, whether under Austrian protection or Sardinian protection. Understandable. The people were fed up with papal tyranny. Now, amazingly, they were still willing to accept the Pope as the spiritual head of their church. They were all Roman Catholics. This is Italy. Okay? They weren't prepared or didn't even consider the possibility of doing what the Protestant reformers did. Strip the Pope not only of his temporal power, but his spiritual power too, and not only that, but to declare him the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist and go to war against him. They were not willing to do that. They still wanted the Pope to be the head of their church. They just wanted him to butt out of government. Well, the Pope won't let the people have it that way. That's tantamount to separating the silver and the golden key, which the papacy claims to possess. The divine right to rule over spiritual things, the divine right to rule over temporal things. King of kings and Lord of lords. He's not content to just be Lord of lords, head of the so-called Christian church. No, he must be a temporal king as well, claiming that he received that power when Constantine left Rome back in the 5th century, the 6th century, and bequeathed all of his temporal power as a king, as an emperor, to the papacy. This the papacy claimed through the pseudo-Isidorian decretals as the very basis for the temporal power. And it is perceived by the papacy that the spiritual authority of the Pope cannot be maintained without the temporal power to enforce it. Okay? It's by force that the papacy maintains its spiritual power. And so this has been the prime occupation and preoccupation of the papacy ever since those times, to maintain that temporal power. And anywhere in the world where his spiritual power is challenged, he uses his temporal power to gather up the military forces of the world to suppress those who deny his spiritual power. It's absolutely necessary from the papacy's point of view that temporal power be maintained and asserted all over the world. You can't have a global government, a global tyranny of the papacy, a new world order, without the help of the temporal power. Now, the Italians, who had become unwilling to submit to the dominion of an absolute monarchy any longer, resisted this scheme from the conviction that it would still keep them at the feet of their old masters. And to make this resistance more effective, several of the Italian provinces transferred their allegiance to Sardinia, thus increasing her strength beyond what it had ever been and adding to her importance as a military power. So they threw their weight upon Sardinia, who was at war with Austria at the time. Now it says, the attitude occupied by Sardinia after these accessions introduced into the politics of Europe a new and most important question: whether these revolted Italian provinces should be compelled to return under the temporal dominion of the Pope, or be allowed to settle their own position and destiny for themselves. Although this question involved the principle of self-government, it was considered as having somewhat an international aspect, and consequently attracted the notice of other powers besides those immediately interested. Louis Napoleon had, in the meantime, made himself Emperor of France, and being fully imbued with his Napoleonic idea of his own importance, ventured to suggest to Pope Pius IX, by way of advice, free advice, that it would be well for Pope Pius IX and the Roman Catholic Church to let the revolted provinces go in peace. The Pope, however, scornfully rejected this advice and declared that he preferred death to such degradation, in which it is fair to suppose he was sincere. the papacy will never give up its temporal power. Okay? Never going to allow these Italian provinces to secede in order to avoid his temporal scepter. Not going to happen. And it says, but his refusal settled nothing, having only invited renewed resistance to his policy among the Italians. Okay? Every time the Pope stood up in abject defiance of the will of the Italian people, it only strengthened the Italian people's resolve to leave the temporal power of the Pope in the dust. Okay? It says it led, however, to such results that the right of the Italian provinces to unite with Sardinia, if they deemed it expedient, was recognized. This was a practical question, as it involved the right of the people of each province to remain under the rule of the Pope or not at their pleasure. As was to be expected, Pope Pius IX considered this a death blow aimed at his temporal power, and consequently anathematized it severely. From the papal standpoint, he could not have done otherwise. And yet, if he had rightfully interpreted the passing events, he could have seen that the temporal scepter was rapidly passing out of his hands, and that severe measures upon his part, instead of preventing, would only hasten the result. So Pope Pius IX didn't really care what the outcome was going to be. He simply was going to maintain his temporal power. That is most important, even though his insistence on maintaining his temporal power actually added fuel to the rebellious tendency of the Italian people. In other words, common sense wasn't prevailing here among the papacy. It's all or nothing for the Pope, and that's the way it is today, too. Now it says the violence of his resistance was responded to by Parma and Modena, both of which provinces were annexed to Sardinia. So the Pope, defending his temporal power, causes two more Italian provinces to secede to Sardinia. And it says Tuscany and the Emilian provinces, followed by the votes of an immense majority of the people. So here's two more. The Pope is bleeding ulteriorly. His Catholics are abandoning ship. They're joining Sardinia. They're not going to submit any longer to papal tyranny. It says other provinces also followed their example, and thus by means of these important accessions, Victor Emmanuel was enabled to signalize his reign by converting Sardinia into the Kingdom of Italy. This measure of attraction, having been presented to the Italians, soon became an enthusiastic rallying point, and the two Sicilies under the head of Garibaldi united with Sardinia by a popular vote nearly unanimous. Umbria and Ancona did the same. One by one, therefore, these Italian provinces, filled with Roman Catholic populations, separated themselves by solemn votes from the temporal dominion of the Pope and left Pope Pius IX to mourn over his rapidly sinking fortunes and to repent, if his excited passions allowed of repentance, over the folly which had produced that result. And what is that folly? The jealous attempt to preserve that which God did not give the Pope, and that is temporal power. The papacy would see its entire kingdom destroyed than to concede that he does not have the divine right to rule over every man, woman, and child on the planet. And this Pope, seeming to have lost his wits, did just that. Let Italy go, and made himself a prisoner in the Vatican with the intent that when the situation changed, that he would resume and regain all of his temporal power. Now it says the government of Sardinia, without unnecessary delay, enacted such laws as were demanded by this new condition of affairs. Victor Emmanuel endeavored consequently to open negotiations with a view to bring about a reconciliation between the two powers, spiritual and temporal. This proposition involved necessarily the separation of church and state, and was designed to define the representative spheres and functions of each, so that in the future there should be no conflict or rivalry between them. So Victor Emmanuel, responding to the will of the people, is going to separate church and state. He began to develop laws to accomplish this. And it says Victor Emmanuel was a Roman Catholic and neither expressed nor entertained the desire to impair in any degree whatsoever the spiritual authority or independence of the Pope. Nor did any such desire prevail among the great body of the people who had aided in bringing about this new order of things. They still remained Roman Catholics as they had always been. All that he and they desired was to make the state independent of the church in the enactment and administration of temporal laws, and to leave the church with the Pope remaining at its head, independent of state in spiritual affairs. That's all they were trying to do, not trying to take anything away from the Pope except his temporal crown. Obviously not following the examples of the Protestants. They still regard, these Italians still regard the Roman Catholic Church to be the one holy Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church outside of which there is no salvation, and that the Pope is the vicar of Christ on earth in spiritual things, not in temporal things. Reminding my listeners that the Protestant Reformation was entirely rebellious against the papacy. No halfway measures for the Protestants. They stripped the Pope of his temporal power and his spiritual power and relegated him to the pit where he belongs. Italy is making a fatal mistake, and they don't know it. It says, if in this a model for imitation had been needed, it would have been found in the form of government constructed by the people of the United States, which must have influenced those conducting Sardinian affairs, at all events, to the extent of separating church and state. Well, just remember that this isn't a complete description. There were many at this time who were truly Protestant in this country and did not recognize the papacy as anything but Antichrist. True, we have a separation of church and state. The state remains separate of the church. The church cannot the state cannot establish a church and sponsor a church with tax money. But nonetheless, it was a government that did recognize the separation of church and state. Now, the importance for us to realize, those who insisted early on in the founding of this country that church and state be separated had in mind that if the church and the state were separated, there would be no way possible for the Roman Catholic Church to ascend to controlling power as it did in Europe. Now, that's never discussed in any discussion about the separation of church and state. It's always left in vanilla and terms that completely turn the light of scrutiny away from the Roman Catholic Church. The reason they separated the church and the state in the founding of this country was to protect itself from the Vatican or the papacy asserting itself as King of Kings and Lord of Lords in this country. Not wanting to offend Roman Catholics that lived in this country, they kept the fact of the purpose of the separation of church and state, the true purpose of the separation of church and state, unstated. But I'm stating it here at Inquisition Update. The primary purpose of separation of church and state was not to make the people free from religion, but to keep them free from papal tyranny. Now it says, but Pope Pius IX could not consent to this without being unfaithful to the cause of the papacy, as distinct from the welfare and best interests of the Church, which manifestly required that he should conciliate and not further antagonize the Roman Catholic populations in whose behalf the proposition of the Sardinian government was made. Instead of conciliation, however, he, with a mind singularly constituted and curiously erratic, surrendered himself entirely to the dominion of his passions, and in order to condemn that form of government and to rebuke the amicable spirit exhibited by Victor Emmanuel, issued a pontifical allocution which may well be called brutum fulmen, in other words, just bluster, phony threats, because it was made entirely harmless by the violence of its language as well as by its inconsiderate and intemperate assault upon the leading principles which prevailed among the modern nations. Inasmuch as this allocution was intended to be an official announcement of the faith maintained by him upon the politico-religious questions involved, and was of so recent date, it deserves special consideration because of its direct bearing upon the question of restoring the Pope's temporal power. Where else shall we look for papal doctrines but to the infallible head of the papacy? He accused the new government of Italy with, quote, attacking the Catholic Church, its wholesome laws, and all of its sacred ministers, unquote, an accusation which lost its force by the very excess of its misinterpretation, as the facts just detailed abundantly show. The burden of this attack was the proposed separation of church and state. But besides other matters of which he complained, he especially designated civil marriages, such as are provided for by the laws of all the states of the United States, which he said, quote, encouraged a concubinage that is perfectly scandalous, unquote. Now this requires some explanation on my part. The Roman Catholic Church, the papacy, regards the institution of marriage as a Roman Catholic sacrament. It is one of the 7 sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church. And therefore, the papacy claims sole jurisdiction over the institution of marriage. In the Roman Catholic canon law, if you are not married by a Roman Catholic priest in a Roman Catholic church, you're not lawfully married. Your marriage is nothing but a license to commit concubinage. The only marriage that is vital is that which was consecrated by a Roman Catholic priest in a Roman Catholic church. And all the states that have rejected the temporal and spiritual power of the Pope, who were married by the state under state laws, were simply living in filthy concubinage with women. They were not married. And that's the way the papacy views marriage today. Might be strange news to those who've never heard it before, but it's the truth. We'll be back right after this.
$100 days, 100 subscribers at $7 will bring FirstAmendmentRadio.com to the minimum level necessary to sustain it through 2015. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com. $7 a month. Really, you can afford that for our Protestant First Amendment rights and the gospel of the kingdom message. Where your heart is, there will your treasure be also. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Have you seen the Left Behind movies? Have you read the Left Behind fictional book series? Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial. the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. Because they see the world stage shaping to fulfill what they have been led to believe is sound biblical interpretation, a Left Behind rapture scenario, this false view of prophecy is reinforced in the mind, not only of its adherents, but also includes those who have been merely exposed to the specific media. Is it possible that false prophecy can be fulfilled? The rapture theories have always been in dispute. Pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib disputes have risen up in exclusively evangelical circles of recent history, so that when true believers don't suddenly disappear, this element will easily go by the wayside when all see a new Jewish temple begin to be built. Will this be part of the great delusion that will come upon the whole earth? It seems that this great prophetic delusion has already overcome practically the entire American evangelical and Christian world. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. To learn more, visit crosstheborder.org. That's CROSS, crosstheborder.org.
Record budget deficits, bankruptcies galore, and the U.S. dollar is at an all-time low. With today's gloomy economic outlook, safe investments are often hard to find. For over a decade, Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company has been helping people secure their future by investing in the precious metals. Melody has the honesty, integrity, and experience that is often lacking in the precious metals business. Let her put it to work for you. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. We'll get immediately back to this most important question of what it was that Pope Pius IX was trying to tell the Italian people who wanted to separate church and state, wanted the papacy to butt out of state affairs, remain head of the church, that's fine with them, but just don't meddle in government affairs anymore. Let the people decide what laws they want to live under. And the papacy literally hurled back at them, you wish to be like the United States, separating church and state. But you don't realize that marriage is a sacrament of the Roman Catholic Church. And if you separate church and state, the state is independent of the church then, and so are your marriages. And henceforth, after you separate the church and the state, those who are married under the authority of the state are no longer married by the church, and therefore are not married at all, because only the Roman Catholic Church can marry. It's a sacrament of the Roman Catholic Church. Marriage is owned by the Roman Catholic Church. No one can solemnize a marriage but a Roman Catholic priest in a Roman Catholic Church. So if you wish to be like the United States of America, did you realize, you Italian Roman Catholics, that everyone who is married in the United States by the states of the United States are living in filthy concubinage? They're not really married. They're living in harlotry, okay? And their children are bastards. They have no heritage, no legal heritage. They belong to the state, not to the church. Do you wish to be like these heretical Protestants in America? Do you wish to live in filthy concubinage like those after whom you are following the example, the Americans? That's what you're going to get if you separate church and state. The priests of the Roman Catholic Church will no longer be marrying. You'll be living in filthy concubinage and raising bastard children. You see what this Roman Catholic Church truly is? Where was the Roman Catholic Church when Adam and Eve were married, huh? Where was the Roman Catholic Church when Abraham and Sarah were married? It's ludicrous, this entire claim of the papacy to have sole jurisdiction over marriage. But yet, the world responds to this claim, except in this case, the Italian people. Okay? They went ahead with their separation of church and state. He says he meant by this that the issue of all marriages solemnized otherwise than by a Roman Catholic clergy are bastardized by the unchristian and illegitimate character of the ceremony. In other words, if it's not conducted in a Roman Catholic church by a Roman Catholic priest, you're not married. He's making it very plain to the Italian people. He's threatening their marriages. And it says, with the express view, doubtless, of fully explaining himself upon the vital question then pending, he announced his claim to civil authority, that is, his right to wear the crown of a temporal king, by declaring that he and his successors never can be, quote, subject to any lay power, unquote, but must, quote, exercise in entire liberty supreme authority and jurisdiction over the church and all its entirety, unquote. In other words, the Pope determines his jurisdiction and his authority. Therefore, he claims jurisdiction over the whole world and over all governments. Elsewise, how can he solemnize marriages unless it is by state authority that the church's authority is maintained? You see the New World Order forming in your mind? That in the New World Order, without the state being bound by the laws of the church, it can't marry. It can't solemnize any marriages, and the whole world lives in concubinage. And according to the Roman Catholic Church, this can't be. So the state must be under the authority of the papacy. Otherwise, the marriages that it conducts are illegitimate. The whole world. This is the New World Order. This is New World Order language that we've just read here. In 1870, the papacy has had in mind a union of church and state on a global basis almost since the very beginning of the papacy, arrogating to itself the divine right to rule both over spiritual things and temporal things, and not one word of it in the Bible. Never mind what the Bible says. The Pope just claims it, and the whole world wonders after the beast. He says his idea, more than once repeated by him and affirmed by his successors, was this: that in whatsoever country the church shall have a footing. In other words, if you live in a country that has one Roman Catholic Church then the Roman Catholic Church has a footing in your country. It shall not be governed by the temporal laws of the state in conflict with its interests, with the Church's interests, but only by the canon laws which it has itself provided and which confer upon the popes plenary and sovereign power to define what they may do and require of others within the domain of faith and morals, along with the coercive power necessary to secure obedience. So if the Roman Catholic Church is established in your country, then the Pope claims divine right to rule your country. Now let's do a little math. By the Pope's own language, if you want to shed yourself of the spiritual and temporal power of the Pope, what must you do? It says, in whatsoever country the Church, the Roman Catholic Church, shall have a footing, it shall not be governed by the temporal laws of the state in conflict with the Church's interests, but only by the canon laws which it has itself provided, and which confer upon the Pope's plenary and sovereign power to define what they may do and require of others within the domain of faith and morals, that's church and state, along with the coercive power necessary to secure obedience. If there's a Roman Catholic Church, one Roman Catholic Church in your nation, the Roman Catholic Church has a footing. And once it has a footing, it demands that the temporal laws of the state shall not conflict with Roman Catholic canon law. And Roman Catholic canon law establishes the jurisdiction of the papacy. In other words, that single Roman Catholic Church in your country has established the jurisdiction of the Pope and has imposed Roman Catholic canon law upon that nation. Now, I ask the question again. If the United States is ever to shed itself of either the temporal or the spiritual power of the Pope, what must it do? It must completely eliminate all Roman Catholic churches from its land. Now, I'm not making this inference. The Pope is making this inference. Let me read it again, make sure my listeners are following. Here's what Pope Pius IX's idea was, and also that of his successor, or his predecessors, that in whatever country the church shall have a footing, it shall not be governed by the temporal laws of the state that are in conflict with the church's interests. It must only be governed by the canon laws which the church has itself provided, and which confer upon the popes plenary and sovereign power to define, that is, to define what they may do and require of others within the jurisdiction of faith and morals. In other words, the Pope has, once the church has a footing, Roman Catholic canon law is imposed, the Pope's plenary jurisdiction takes over, and he dictates all the laws both regarding faith and morals, and he is also imbued with the coercive power necessary to secure that obedience. Wherever country that the Roman Catholic Church has a foothold, this is what takes place. The Pope takes over. The civil laws cannot contradict the canon laws of the Roman Catholic Church. The Pope defines his power and his jurisdiction both over faith and morals, and he also wields whatever power necessary to secure obedience to both. And I ask the listeners, once again, this is the language of the papacy, not Tom Friess. You just heard what the Pope said. I simply am asking the question, if this nation is ever to relieve itself, as Italy attempted to do, of the temporal and the spiritual power of the Pope, what must it do? Well, it must remove from its country the Roman Catholic Church's footing. That's by simply eliminating every Roman Catholic Church from terra firma, from this country. That's the logic, simple logic, that I don't have a monopoly on. Every one of my listeners has a brain to think, and you listen to the language that's spoken by this papacy, this Pope Pius IX, you can only come to one conclusion. If there's a Roman Catholic Church in your country, the Vatican has a footing, the Pope rules. Canon law is imposed, and he is imbued with whatever power necessary to enforce obedience to Roman Catholic canon law and the Pope's dictates. And the civil law, though it may maintain itself, it cannot pass any laws that contradict or the Roman Catholic canon law or limit the Pope's jurisdiction and power. And once again, I'll ask my listeners, if you want to rid yourself of this papal influence, what must you do? According to the papacy, you have to remove this footing. And I got to tell my listeners that the footing of the papacy in this country is now a controlling interest in our government. This is a Roman Catholic country, according to the view of the papacy. And all those who reject the temporal or spiritual power of the Pope are heretics. Roman Catholic canon law demands that all heretics be exterminated. That's not Tom Press. That's Roman Catholic canon law. And that's what's happening in this country, slowly but surely. Protestantism is being extirpated and annihilated. And when Rome gets so much of the upper hand that she can do without restraint whatever she wants to do, there's going to be an inquisition, an inquest in this country, just like there was during the Dark Ages, the Old World Order, when the Pope had his sway. The Pope's footing being firmly established over nearly since the founding of this country has slowly but surely increased the power and influence of both the spiritual and the temporal power of the papacy to the point where now it, without fear of damage to itself, can impose its will upon the people, and it'll do it through the government. They're going to have their new world order, and anybody who stands in its way is going to be trampled underfoot. Just like the martyrs of the Old World Order, the Protestant Reformers, the Waldenses, the Albigenses, the Hussites, all of them, we're going to take our place right beside them. Those who put up any resistance to this Vatican Jesuit-led New World Order are going to be extirpated and annihilated just like they were. That's what Rome has in plan. If this is not Rome's plan for the United States of America, then we cannot rely upon history to teach us anything. Because all of history drips with the blood of the martyrs and the saints of Jesus who rejected the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist, both spiritually and temporally. They preached against Antichrist. By the power of Jesus Christ, they preached against Antichrist. They did not want the people to be deceived. They did not want the people to be slaves to this papal Pharaoh. They demanded liberty. They demanded the liberty wherewith Christ made them free, and they rejected the bondage of Rome. But the Antichrist was given power over them. And he demonstrated that power by wringing from their flesh every drop of blood that would come forth, burned them to ashes, tortured them beyond comprehension. And yet, to their dying breaths, they rejected the papacy, held firm in the liberty wherewith Christ made them free. I hope there are some yet in this country who would suffer torture and burning at the stake for the sake of Christ and his gospel. But as a nation, this country has gone the way of Israel. They're rejecting their Messiah, and they're making their bed with the whore that rides the bloody beast in Revelation chapter 17. He says, in whatsoever country the church shall have a footing, it shall not be governed by the temporal laws of the state in conflict with the church's interests, but only by the Roman Catholic canon law which it has itself provided, and which confer upon the Pope's plenary and sovereign power to define what they may do and require of others within the domain of both faith and morals, along with the coercive power necessary to secure obedience. R.W. Thompson continues, he says, seemingly unconscious that he was placing himself in the track of the popular storm when he Speaking of Pope Pius IX, R.W. Thompson says, seemingly unconscious that he was placing himself in the track of the popular storm then sweeping away the props upon which the papal throne had long rested, he fancied that his quote-unquote apostolic authority would yet enable him to direct its course as would prevent the final wreck of the temporal power. Putting on, therefore, his full papal armor, in imitation of some of his predecessors, he endeavored to upturn and destroy the new government of Italy by the very thunder of his anathemas. He accordingly abrogated and declared, quote, null and void and without force and effect, unquote, all its laws and decrees in conflict with his claim of supreme and absolute authority over both spiritual and temporal affairs throughout the whole of Italy, including the provinces annexed to Sardinia, exclamation point. It requires a very inventive imagination to conceive of an act of more supreme folly than this useless allocution, says R.W. Thompson. But you must know that Pope Pius IX, as delusional as he may seem in making this allocution, because it came from his mouth, the very first pope in history that ever could claim himself to be infallible when he speaks to the church on matters related to faith and morals, this infallible pope has just set the law of the church by these utterances. His word becomes canon law. It becomes a matter of the faith, and the Pope is going to extend its spiritual and temporal power not over the whole of Italy, but according to the provinces annexed to Sardinia and every nation on the planet. This first infallible Pope spoke infallibly when he uttered this allocution against Italy, who is in abject rebellion against his temporal power. And no matter what happens to the papacy for any determinate period of time, the papacy will never relinquish its claim to universal temporal and spiritual authority. King of kings and Lord of lords. R.W. Thompson continues, he says, if Pope Pius IX had been less perturbed and calm enough to reason logically, he might have observed how fatal to his own conclusion was an important confession made by him in this official allocution. Without seeming to comprehend its full meaning and force, he declared it to be, quote, a singular arrangement of divine providence, unquote, that the Pope, quote, was invested with his civil authority, unquote, at the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. That is, during the latter half of the 5th century and nearly 500 years after the beginning of the Christian era. In this he admits, certainly by necessary implication, that during all the long period preceding that event, the affairs of the church have been conducted without the assistance of a temporal monarch at Rome or elsewhere, and by spiritual authority alone, by bishops who looked after religious and not political affairs. Now let me just tell you what might have just breezed by you without notice. The papacy claims this King of Kings status, his monarchical status, as having been received by divine providence when the Caesar of the old pagan Roman Empire left Rome and set up his shop in Constantinople and left the temporal power with the Bishop of Rome. This is right here in this book is the recording in history as told by R.W. Thompson, what the Apostle Paul said to the Thessalonians. He who now letteth will let until he be taken out of the way, and then that man of sin shall be revealed, the son of perdition. R.W. Thompson recognizes that the papacy claims that it got this kingly power, this tyrannical, monarchical, divine right to rule over all the affairs of every man, woman, and child on the planet. He got it in the late part of the 5th century when Caesar Constantine left Rome and bequeathed all of his temporal power to the papacy. It was the Caesars of Rome that withstood or resisted or restrained the rising of the Antichrist, the man of sin, the son of perdition. And it was when Caesar laid down his temporal sword and his temporal crown that the papacy picked it up. Prophecy fulfilled in history. Now, I was challenged not long ago by one of my listeners, Tom, you read all those books. Wouldn't you just better be reading the Scriptures? Listen, without the knowledge of history, the Scriptures they can't be understood. Who could have ever seen that this prophecy of Paul, he who now restrains will restrain until he be taken out of the way, and then that man of sin shall be revealed, the son of perdition, how could that be realized as fulfilled unless we see it in history? The Bible is the best history book on the planet, but it doesn't record the fulfillment of the Bible prophecy that is fulfilled in our day. It is history books written by true historians that show us the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. R.W. Thompson is showing us the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. The papacy doesn't claim its temporal power until the restrainer left Rome and left his King of Kings status to that man of sin, the son of perdition, the popes of Rome. And Pope Pius IX is just one of the successors of that papal Antichrist dynasty that began in the year 538 A.D. We'll talk about it more tomorrow on the program. You've been listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. Stay tuned for more godly programming on First Amendment Radio.
Visit crosstheborder.org, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, the rapture will be canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.